The words landed across the ballroom floor like a dropped tray of glass. And for one long second, nobody in the room remembered how to keep talking. Isabelle Kane's fingers were still curled around Marisol Doyle's wrist when Damon Russo crossed the floor toward them. Unhurried, the way a verdict is unhurried. Isabelle let go so fast it looked like an accident. Marisol didn't step back, and didn't step behind him either. She'd spent her whole life being underestimated by people who dressed better than her, and she wasn't about to start needing rescue now. Not in front of 200 people who'd already decided who she was the moment she walked in wearing flower dust instead of diamonds. Damon didn't raise his voice. "Whatever you think you know about her," he said. "You don't. She built something with her own 2 hands while people like you were still deciding whether she deserved a chair at this table." Nobody spoke, because 9 mornings earlier, none of the people watching had known that one of the most feared men in Ashcombe had been quietly walking into a struggling little bakery. Every single day before sunrise, and only Damon, and a single food-stained recipe card that had outlived his mother by 6 years, knew exactly why. 9 mornings before any of this, Damon Russo had never once set foot inside the corner loaf. He walked in that first morning holding nothing but a folded index card, worn soft at the creases, the ink half-faded from decades of hands. 2 men trailed behind him at a careful distance, both of them clearly uncomfortable, standing in a shop that smelled like cinnamon and yeast instead of leather and cigars. Marisol glanced up from behind the counter, took in the tailored coat. The 2 men positioning themselves near the door without seeming to realize they were doing it, and went back to pulling a tray of morning rolls before they burned. "Give me 1 second. One of the men actually smiled at that, quickly hiding it. Damon didn't. He stood very still in the middle of the shop, like a man unused to waiting for anyone. And Marisol noticed that too, filed it away, and didn't hurry. When she finally came to the counter, wiping flour off her hands onto her apron, Damon set the card down on the glass like it might shatter. "I need this recreated. Exactly. Marisol picked it up carefully. The handwriting was elegant, looping, clearly a woman's, and half the measurements had faded past legibility. Braided rye, sweet crust, a note in the margin that just said, "For Leo, always double the honey." She turned it over, looking for a name, a date, anything. The paper itself told her, almost as much as the ink did. Soft at every fold from decades of being carried, one corner stained with something dark and old that had probably been butter once. The kind of card that had clearly lived in an apron pocket far longer than it had ever lived in a drawer. Whoever wrote this, baked Marisol thought. Not for show. For someone. Whose is this? My mother's. She's been gone 11 years. My brother's birthday is in 9 days. This was the only thing she ever baked for him that he actually loved. And I have spent the last 9 years bringing him flowers instead, because I never learned how to do this. And I'm done pretending flowers were ever the point. Marisol didn't offer sympathy, because she'd learned a long time ago that grief rarely wanted it delivered on the spot, especially not from a stranger behind a bakery counter. She studied the card instead, running her thumb along a faded line. This fold technique's nearly extinct. Whoever taught your mother learned it from someone old-fashioned. I can try. I can't promise exact recipes like this. Half of what made them work was never written down. It was in her hands. Then learn what's in yours, Damon said, and something about the flatness of it, the total lack of charm in the request, made Marisol respect him slightly more than she wanted to. She tried it 7 different ways over the next 4 days. The first 2 batches came out to dents. The third cracked wrong. Damon came back each morning to check, standing at the same spot by the register, never once suggesting she hurry, never once offering to pay her more to move faster, which surprised her more than anything else about him. "You could throw money at this," she told him, on day 3. Testing him. "Money doesn't know how to braid dough. No. But most men in your position would still try." He almost smiled. "Almost. I've learned that when something matters, throwing money at it is usually just a way of not having to sit with how little control you actually have over it." Marisol looked up at that, surprised into silence for exactly 1 second. before pretending to be very interested in her mixing bowl again. On day 4, the shop's ancient oven died mid-batch, coughing out a plume of smoke that sent both of Damon's men lunging for the fire extinguisher before Marisol waved them off. "Come already, unplugging it at the wall. It does this. Ignore the men in suits, boys. Sit down." Damon watched her handle it without a single raised voice, without panic, competent in a way that had nothing to do with him, and everything to do with 11 years of running this place alone, and understood, standing there covered in a light dusting of flour that had drifted off her sleeve. That he had started coming back for reasons that had very little to do with bread. By day 5, her 17-year-old part-time employee, Eli, had started narrating Damon's visits under his breath to the other staff. The mob boss, he calls himself, is doing hand exercises with dough again. Real breaking news, and Marisol had to physically bite the inside of her cheek not to laugh in front of a customer. On the 6th morning, a delivery truck failed to show with the shop's flour order, and Marisol spent 45 minutes on hold with the supplier before Damon quietly stepped outside and made one call of his own. 20 minutes later, a different truck pulled up entirely, driven by a man who apologized so profusely, Marisol wondered what exactly Damon had said to him. What did you do? Made a phone call. To who? A man who owes a man a favor. It's a boring answer, I promise. It's still you fixing my problem without asking. You're right, he said, and to her genuine surprise, actually looked apologetic about it. Old habit. I'll ask first, next time. Next time didn't come for 3 days, which she noticed and appreciated more than she let on. That afternoon, an older regular named Mrs. Alvarez came in for her usual and immediately recognized Damon from a business magazine spread on the counter that Eli had left open by accident. You're Damon Russo. The whole shop went quiet. Marisol looked between the headline, a piece about a hostile leveraged buyout, numbers with more zeros than she'd ever earn in a decade, and the man standing at her counter with flour on his cuff from where he'd insisted, against her advice, on trying to help fold dough the day before. She walked back to the mixing station instead of reacting. You're still folding it wrong. By the way, that's it. Most people react differently once they know. I already knew you were stubborn. Now I just know you're stubborn with a corporate jet. Presumably, something escaped Damon that wasn't quite a laugh, low and surprised out of him, and both his men turned to look like they'd witnessed something rare that should have ended his visits. He'd learned by then that the recipe would never come out identical. Some things really had died with his mother. Exactly as Marisol warned him, but close enough, honest enough, better than nothing. He had no more excuse to keep returning. He returned anyway, the next morning, before the shop had even unlocked its doors. By day 7, Marisol had stopped pretending his visits were only about the bread. She hadn't yet figured out what else they were about, only that he'd started watching how she ran the place instead of watching the clock, the way he used to on the first few mornings. That same week, a customer in an expensive coat came in demanding a refund after Eli mixed up a custom order for a corporate lunch, then began loudly questioning why Marisol trusted a teenager to handle anything that mattered. Eli's ears went red behind the register. Marisol stepped between them without raising her voice. He made a mistake. I'll fix it myself. Free of charge. I want to speak to whoever's actually in charge here. You're speaking to her. The customer's eyes flicked toward Damon, standing quietly by the window, clearly assuming he was the one who owned the place. I'd like his opinion on how this gets handled. He doesn't work here, Marisol said flatly. I do. And you're welcome to take your business elsewhere if a 17-year-old's honest mistake is more than you can tolerate today. The man left without another word, muttering under his breath. Eli exhaled like he'd been holding it the whole time. You're not going to yell at me? You made a mistake. Fix it. Learn from it. Move on. Everybody who's ever run a register has burned an order at least once. Even you. Especially me. Ask me about the wedding cake I ruined in my second year sometime. When you've got 20 minutes to spare, Damon watched the whole exchange without saying a word, and understood watching her defend a nervous teenager without an ounce of theater in it. Exactly why he'd started rearranging his mornings around this particular 600 square feet of flour and butter. She protected people without ever making them feel small for needing it. She corrected without humiliating. And somewhere in the middle of watching her do it effortlessly for a kid who wasn't even hers to protect, Damon realized he'd started hoping, quietly and without permission, that she might one day extend the same patience toward him. An elderly customer named Mr. Feldman came in that week, frantic, because his insurance had lapsed and he couldn't afford his heart medication until his next check landed, 9 days out. Marisol overheard it by accident, quietly slipped an envelope with $300 from the shop's tip jar into his coat pocket before he left, and told him she'd found it on the floor when he tried to return it. "You do that a lot?" Damon asked afterward, having watched the whole exchange from a corner table. "Do what? Give away money you don't actually have?" "I have exactly as much as I need." He needed more than I did that day. Simple math. That afternoon, $4,000 appeared in the shop's business account with no note attached. Marisol found the deposit before closing and marched straight to where Damon sat with a coffee he hadn't finished. "Absolutely not. It's a donation. It's $4,000 for a bakery that makes maybe $600 a week in actual profit. That's not a donation, that's an anchor." She folded her arms. "I know exactly what $4,000 buys. Damon, leverage, obligation, a reason for you to think you get an opinion on how I run this place. I don't want an opinion. Then you definitely don't want to give me $4,000. She returned $3,000 of it. The remaining one stayed only after she made him agree, out loud, in front of Eli as a witness, that it came with no strings, no ownership, and no attempt to quietly buy the building out from under her landlord. The fact that she specified the building made Damon go very still. "You thought I might actually try that? I've known you a week, and you've already tried to solve one problem with $4,000. Money's the only language you were ever taught fluently. I'm not interested in being translated." Damon didn't respond to that for a long moment. Men challenged his decisions constantly, always because they wanted more from him, more money, more access, more protection. This woman kept pushing back because she wanted less, and it unsettled something in him that no boardroom ever had. That night, alone in a townhouse far too large for one person, he took the recipe card out of his coat pocket and read the margin note again. For Leo, always double the honey. His mother had died believing that love and sweetness were interchangeable ingredients, and Damon had spent 11 years assuming the same thing could be solved with numbers on a wire transfer. He was starting, slowly, to suspect she'd been closer to right than he had. The first real threat arrived on a Thursday, and it didn't come from a person at all. It came from a notification. A local food magazine that had quietly nominated the Corner Loaf for its annual Best Undiscovered Bakery honor. A nomination Marisol had worked toward for 3 years without ever telling anyone she was hoping for it. Suddenly found its public voting page flooded overnight with 200 one-star reviews, all claiming food poisoning, all posted within the same 6-hour window, all written in language just similar enough to sound coordinated, and just different enough to pass automated filters. Marisol read through the first 30 of them at 2 in the morning with her stomach in knots, recognizing exactly none of the names, none of the details matching anything her shop had ever served. By morning, the magazine's editorial board had quietly paused her nomination pending review. Careful, apologetic emails that still amounted to the same devastating outcome, her name pulled from consideration. Days before the announcement, with no clear way to prove any of it was fake, she didn't tell Damon that day. She told herself it wasn't his problem, that she'd built this shop out of a shuttered dry cleaner and a 5-year loan she was still 3 years from paying off, and she wasn't going to hand her fear to a man who solved everything by writing a check. But Damon noticed anyway, the tightness in her shoulders, the way she stopped teasing him about the honey ratio, the hours she spent hunched over her laptop instead of the ovens. Damon had, in truth, already run a full background check on her before he'd finished his first cup of shop coffee that very first morning. Not from suspicion, exactly. More from the same reflex that made him double-check every contract before signing it. Reyes had the file on his desk within 2 days. 11 years running the corner loaf on a loan she was steadily paying down. A pastry certification she'd let lapse the year her father got sick. A stretch of missed payments she'd repaid herself, dollar by dollar, rather than declare bankruptcy and start over clean. No debts to anyone questionable. No family reaching for a cut. A landlord who spoke about her like she was the reason the whole block hadn't fallen apart years ago. Clean, Reyes had said, sliding the folder across the desk. Suspiciously clean. Damon hadn't opened it for 3 days. When he finally did, he read it once, closed it, and never opened it again. Not because he'd stopped wanting to know things, but because by then he'd already learned everything that mattered by watching her return $3,000 she could easily have kept without consequence. The file only confirmed what he'd already decided to believe. It never replaced it. He didn't ask her directly. He had his associate, Reyes, quietly pull whatever public data existed on the review accounts. It took Reyes 2 days to come back with something that made Damon's jaw tighten in a way his men had learned to recognize as dangerous. Every one of those accounts, Reyes reported, was created in the same 48-hour window, using burner emails tied to the same payment processor. Same processors being used before, twice, actually, both times, against small bakeries that got acquired within 6 months by a chain called Larkspur Baking Co. After their ratings collapsed. Who owns Larkspur? Privately held, majority investors shielded behind 3 shell entities. Reyes paused. But the address on the original incorporation, filing traces back to Isabelle Kane's family trust. Damon said nothing for a long time. He recognized a pattern when he saw one patient, deniable, built to survive exactly the kind of scrutiny that would collapse a clumsier scheme, and aimed squarely at the one person who had never once tried to use his name for anything. He still didn't tell Marisol what he knew. Not yet. 3 days later, an electrical fault sparked in the wall behind Marisol's main oven, filling the shop with smoke. 20 minutes before a scheduled tasting for a wedding client she couldn't afford to lose. The fire department cleared the building for the day, and every commercial kitchen Marisol called for emergency use was either booked solid or too far to make the deadline. Damon, standing beside her on the sidewalk, watching smoke curl out the propped-open door, said the one thing he'd been avoiding saying for 9 days. I have a kitchen you can use. You have a whole team of chefs. I'm not taking over someone's not that kitchen. The building was 3 blocks over, unassuming, a faded sign that still read Canovas in paint so old it had gone the color of weak tea. Damon unlocked the door with a key that clearly hadn't turned in years, and the dust that greeted them told its own story before he said a word. This was my mother's, he said. The original shop. Before the money, before any of it, she ran this place for 15 years. Nobody's opened it since she died. Marisol stepped inside carefully, taking in the shelves still stocked with mixing bowls nobody had touched in over a decade. A chalkboard with a menu still half legible. A framed photograph behind the register of a woman laughing mid-flower fight with 2 young boys, one of them clearly Damon, the other unmistakably the same face from the magazine article about a car accident 9 years back that Marisol had quietly looked up the week before and never mentioned. You kept it exactly like this. I didn't know how to walk back in without deciding she was really gone. Marisol didn't offer comfort in words. She found an apron hanging on a hook that had clearly belonged to his mother, put it on without asking, and got to work saving the wedding order using an oven that hadn't been lit in 11 years. Damon stayed the whole night, handing her ingredients, learning which bowl she meant when she just said the blue one. Around midnight, sorting through a cabinet for a second sheet pan, Marisol found a shoebox tucked behind a stack of unused tablecloths, birthday cards, dozens of them, some clearly from a much younger Damon, block letters and crooked hearts, others in a looser, older hand she guessed belonged to Leo. She didn't open a single one. She simply set the box on the counter where Damon would see it when he was ready, and kept working. He found it an hour later, midnight, and went very quiet. He read through maybe 6 of them, standing at the counter, his jaw tight, before closing the lid and setting the box gently to one side, like something that needed to be handled a different night. By a different version of himself. You okay? Yeah. He didn't sound entirely convinced of it. Just wasn't expecting to find him here too. Thought I'd already said everything I was going to say to my mother in this building. Forgot he grew up in it as much as I did. Marisol didn't push. She handed him the rolling pin instead, nodded at the dough, and let him work through it the way she'd learned over 11 years. That most people worked through things best with their hands busy and nobody watching too closely. Somewhere around 2 in the morning, exhausted and flour-streaked, they sat on overturned crates eating the burnt edges of a test batch because neither of them could stand to waste it. Some doors don't need a reason to open twice, Marisol thought later. They just need someone patient enough to stand in the doorway until you're ready. The wedding tasting went perfectly the next morning, and neither of them mentioned Canovas again for the rest of the week, but something between them had shifted permanently. The particular way that trust changes a room simply by having been let inside it. Once Isabelle Kane arrived at the corner loaf the following Tuesday wearing the expression of a woman who had never expected to enter a bakery this small and was already unimpressed by the ceiling height. So you're the one everyone's talking about. Depends who's asking. And about what? Isabelle's smile arrived half a beat too late to be convincing. I've heard so much about this place. Some of it wasn't even from the reviews. Eli, watching from behind the register, went very still. Later, cornering Marisol near the storeroom while Damon was occupied with a phone call outside, Isabelle's voice turned pleasant in the exact way that always preceded something sharp. Our families have known each other for years, she said. Men like Damon can find something like this charming for a while. That doesn't mean they build a future around a woman who smells like a bread oven. Instead of a boardroom, the old wound tore open with surgical precision. Years earlier, Marisol had built a life around a man while he clawed his way up from nothing, covering his rent, believing in him when his own family didn't, only to watch success introduce him to people who found her a little too much of everything, too loud, too soft, too visible in a room. You're wonderful, he'd told her once, gently, like it was a kindness. You're just not who I pictured standing beside me once I actually made it. Marisol had spent years refusing to let that sentence define the rest of her life. And here was a stranger finding its echo without even trying hard. You might be right about one thing, Marisol said. I don't fit in every room. She stepped closer. But neither do you, when the cameras aren't pointed at you. I just don't organize my entire life around getting invited. She walked away before Isabelle could answer. It didn't make the words hurt any less. That afternoon, Isabelle made one call to a marketing contractor her family's holding company had used before. For exactly this kind of situation. 2 more waves, she said, before the awards ceremony. I want her nomination dead beyond appeal. Not just paused. Marisol spent the rest of that afternoon reorganizing a shelf that didn't need reorganizing. Sorting spice jars by expiration date instead of alphabetically the way she always kept them. Because her hands needed something to do that wasn't replaying the sentence Isabelle had left lodged under her ribs. She'd heard some version of it once before, years ago, from a man who'd meant it kindly and delivered it like a verdict. And she'd promised herself she would never again let herself shrink to make room for someone else's comfort. Eli found her still at it an hour after close. You good, boss? The words startled her a little, small and ordinary and entirely her own. Nothing like the careful way Isabelle's friends had said her name earlier that day. I'm fine. Go home. He hesitated in the doorway. For what it's worth, that Kane woman's full of it. Anybody who's watched you run this place for 5 minutes knows you don't need anyone's permission for anything. You built this whole thing out of a dry cleaner and a 5-year loan. She showed up in a dress that costs more than your oven. Marisol laughed despite herself. The first real laugh she'd managed since Isabelle walked out the door, and something in her chest finally loosened, enough to let her breathe normally again. Damon noticed the shift in Marisol immediately that week. The careful politeness where teasing used to live. The way she thanked him for coffee instead of arguing. About the honey ratio, one more time. What happened? Nothing. You're lying. Careful, I might start believing you actually know me. Normally he'd have enjoyed that. This time he heard the distance underneath it, and understood he could solve it with one phone call and an afternoon of leverage. Instead, he did the harder thing. He gave her room, and showed up the next morning without a single excuse prepared at all. No card today. No. Then why are you here? Because I wanted to see you, and I'm done pretending the recipe's the reason. Men like you can drop into places like this whenever it's convenient, Marisol said finally. And then, eventually, you go back to a world where everything actually matches. Damon went very still. A world where everything matches. Nothing in my world has matched anything in years, he said. Not since Leo. I spent a decade surrounded by people who fit my life perfectly, and never once made me want to stay in a room longer than the photographs required. You did? The first morning, before you even knew who I was. Before she could answer, Eli burst through the back door holding a burnt tray and a look of pure panic. Boss, the wedding order. I think I set the timer for Fahrenheit instead of Marisol was already moving. And Damon watched her go, understanding that he no longer needed a recipe card as a reason to walk through that door. He'd finally admitted, if only to himself, that he was coming back for her, the night before the ceremony. Damon showed up at closing with no card, no crisis, and no excuse at all. Just a question he'd clearly rehearsed and still fumbled slightly on delivery. Come to dinner with me. Not the shop, not the ceremony, nowhere either of us has to perform for an audience. Just dinner. Marisol raised an eyebrow. Where? There's a diner 2 blocks from here. Terrible coffee. I've driven past it for years, and never once gone in. Why now? Because I want the first place I take you somewhere that matters to be somewhere I chose for the right reasons. Not because it photographs well. The diner had cracked vinyl booths and a jukebox that only half worked. And Damon Russo, a man who could have flown in a private chef for a first date and never blinked at the cost, sat across from her, eating a grilled cheese sandwich like it was the most important meal of his life. Marisol watched him fumble with a ketchup bottle that refused to cooperate, and thought, not for the first time, that she had never once seen him look more like himself. You're staring. You're bad at ketchup bottles. It's a novelty. I run 4 companies, none of which apparently prepared you for condiments. He laughed. The real one. Low and startled out of him, loud enough that the couple in the next booth glanced over, and neither of them cared even slightly. Reyes texted twice during dinner, about something urgent downtown. Damon didn't check his phone once, and Marisol noticed that too. Filed it away quietly next to the shoebox of birthday cards and the coffee he still couldn't get right, and the dozen other small proofs that had slowly, unglamorously, become the entire foundation of whatever this was turning into. The award ceremony arrived 2 days later, hosted at a rented ballroom downtown, and Isabelle came with an entourage. 3 friends from her circle, and several culinary sponsors whose opinions could move faster than any editorial board. Damon arrived early with Marisol, and the sight of a man in a $3,000 suit carrying a tray of sample rolls for her table had already turned more heads than either of them wanted. Brought the help, yourself tonight, Isabelle said, watching Damon set the tray down. He's better at carrying trays than kneading dough. Honestly, I was hoping our last conversation might have spared you tonight's embarrassment. Everyone can see it. Isabelle continued, loud enough for 2 sponsors to overhear. You found yourself a reason to keep him coming around, and now you're enjoying watching him carry your trays. You're giving me a lot of credit for a man who still can't get his honey ratio right after 2 weeks of practice. Sponsor laughed, despite himself. Isabelle's smile thinned, and her gaze traveled deliberately over Marisol's body. Enjoying someone in private is very different from being brought to something like this in public. Men with names like his understand that difference, eventually. If the worst thing you can find to criticize is the size of the woman standing in front of you, Marisol said evenly, then I think tonight's actually going pretty well for me. Silence rippled outward. Marisol turned to walk toward her own table. Isabelle grabbed her arm hard. Enough to leave a mark. Don't walk away from me. Don't you dare touch her. Everything stopped. Isabelle let go instantly as Damon crossed the room, but Marisol turned to face him before he could say another word. This is mine. I've got it. For a moment the whole room seemed to wait and see whether Damon Russo would tolerate being corrected in public. He nodded instead. I know. Then, to Isabelle, with no threat in his voice, only fact. Let's clear something up, since you seem confused. She never chased a single thing from me. I walked into her shop 9 mornings ago holding my dead mother's recipe card because I couldn't face my brother's birthday without it, and she's the only reason I finally could. Isabelle's composure cracked thin and public. You'll regret this. Is that a threat? Damon's voice dropped colder than most of the room had ever heard from him. Because I've noticed something interesting this week. 200 fabricated reviews hit her nomination page for days after your family's marketing contractor was paid through the same shell account that funded 2 prior acquisitions by Larkspur Baking Co., the company quietly, majority owned by your family trust. The temperature of the room changed entirely. A sponsor set his glass down without appearing to notice. Isabelle's friends had already begun drifting toward the exit. You have no proof of that, Isabelle said, but the crack arrived a half-second before the words did. I don't need proof, Damon said. She does. And she's had a data analyst tracing the account activity since Tuesday. Marisol hadn't known about the analyst. Watching him say it so calmly, she understood he'd hired someone for her without asking permission, without taking a single decision out of her hands, only making sure the evidence existed while she built her own case on top of it. It was, she'd think later, the most romantic thing anyone had ever quietly done for her. And neither of them would have used that word out loud in the moment. You should leave, Marisol said. This time, Isabelle did. Only once the room began breathing normally again did Marisol pull Damon aside. Gratitude and anger tangled together in a way she didn't have words for yet. You knew about Larkspur. About the reviews. I found out about Larkspur 8 days ago. The reviews, 4 days ago. I should have told you both times. Why didn't you? Because you told me money was the only language I'd ever been taught fluently, he said, and, for once, there was no defensiveness in it at all. I was trying to learn a different one before. I opened my mouth again. He took the recipe card out of his jacket pocket and held it out to her. You asked whose handwriting this was. I never told you the rest. My mother taught herself to bake after my father left. Canovas kept us fed for 15 years before the money came from somewhere else entirely. When she died, I told myself the bakery didn't matter anymore because we didn't need it anymore. I was wrong. It was never about needing it. It was the only place I ever remember all 4 of us being happy at the same time. Marisol's anger finally drained out of her. Leah loved this recipe because it was the last thing that felt like her. Damon said quietly. When Isabelle said what she said tonight, about you not belonging somewhere, I understood, finally, exactly what my mother spent 15 years proving wrong. You don't earn a place by shrinking to fit it. You earn it by refusing to. I'm not interested in being anyone's secret, Damon. You were never one. I just needed 9 mornings to catch up to what I already felt on the first dot. The magazine's editorial board reopened the nomination review within days. Once the fraudulent review pattern became impossible to ignore even without Marisol's help, but she didn't wait for their goodwill. She spent the next week building her own case from the shop's own point of sale and social media analytics, cross-referencing timestamps, device fingerprints, and payment metadata against every account that had posted a fake review, then compiling it into a report clean enough that a journalist wouldn't need to take her word for anything. The night before the hearing, Marisol laid every spreadsheet and timestamp across her kitchen table in careful rows. rehearsing her statement out loud to an empty apartment until her voice stopped shaking. Damon had offered his own legal team more than once. She'd said no every time, and by the third refusal, he'd finally understood it wasn't pride. She needed to know, for herself as much as for anyone watching, that she could win this without him standing between her and the fight. He showed up anyway at 6 the next morning with coffee made exactly the way she liked it. The ratio slightly wrong the way it always somehow was. And sat with her for 20 minutes while she read through her notes one final time, saying nothing at all. Just being present in the particular way that mattered more than any advice could have. She didn't hand it to Damon to deliver. She requested a public hearing with the magazine's ethics board herself. Invited a local business reporter who'd covered small business fraud before, and laid out every timestamp and shell account trail in a conference room that smelled nothing like her bakery at all. The hearing took 40 minutes. The board reinstated her nomination unanimously, referred the review platform's fraud team to investigate the shell accounts further, and opened an inquiry into 2 other small bakeries that had mysteriously collapsed under similar review floods the previous year. Both later linked to Larkspur acquisitions. A story ran 2 days later, under a headline nobody had asked for: Small Bakery Owner uncovers review bombing scheme tied to competitor's secret investor. One of those owners, a quiet widow named Priya, who ran a small cardamom bun stand to neighborhoods over, showed up at the corner loaf a week after the story broke, carrying a box of her own pastries, insisting on paying Marisol back somehow, even though Marisol refused every time she offered money. "I don't need paying back," Marisol told her. "I needed someone to believe me back when nobody else did. Once. This is just passing that forward." Priya cried a little, right there at the counter. And Eli quietly slid her a free coffee without being asked, because he'd apparently learned more from watching Marisol run this place than either of them realized. 3 other bakery owners, who'd quietly folded under similar pressure, came forward within the week, one of them close to signing away her shop to Larkspur out of pure exhaustion before Marisol spent 2 evenings walking her through exactly how to build the same kind of evidentiary case. Larkspur Baking Co. quietly withdrew its expansion plans in Ashcombe before the story finished its second news cycle. Isabelle's name stopped appearing at the events Marisol occasionally found herself attending, and when it did surface, it was mostly in the past tense. The way people discuss a scandal that's already finished doing its damage. That night, after the reporter left and the editorial board's formal apology email finally arrived, Marisol found Damon standing alone inside Canova's, sleeves rolled up, the ancient oven finally cleaned and relit for the first time in 11 years. "You never told me why you kept this place exactly the way she left it. You never asked before. Tonight, I'm asking now." He was quiet for a long moment, running his hand along the counter his mother used to stand behind. Leo used to say I loved spreadsheets more easily than people. He wasn't wrong. This place was the one thing I never learned to run like a business, because the second I did, it would stop being hers. Marisol looked around at the dusty shelves, the faded chalkboard menu, the photograph of a woman, mid-flower fight with 2 boys who'd both, in their own ways, spent years trying to keep some part of her alive. "Is that why you kept coming back to my shop? At first. And now?" He reached for her hand, instead of answering, and for once, that was enough. 2 weeks before that birthday arrived, Damon asked Marisol something he'd clearly been turning over for days, standing at the counter with his hands full of flour, and no real reason left to be there except that he wanted to be. "Would you come with me? To the cemetery? I've never brought anyone before, not even Isabelle. In all those years, your families pretended you'd end up together, especially not Isabelle. She never once asked what his name was." Marisol didn't answer right away, turning the question over the way she turned over a difficult dough, testing its edges before committing. "I'd be honored," she said finally, and meant every word of it, understanding that he wasn't asking her to fill an empty seat beside him. He was asking her to be let all the way in, past the last locked door he had left. Months later, on what would have been Leo's 32nd birthday, Damon didn't bring flowers to the cemetery for the first time in a decade. He brought a braided rye loaf, slightly imperfect, made with his own hands under Marisol's patient supervision the night before. The honey doubled exactly the way the margin note demanded. He stood at his brother's grave longer than he ever had before, and when he finally turned to leave, Marisol was still there, waiting. Not because he needed rescuing from the moment, but because some things were easier to carry when somebody simply stayed. Isabelle sent one final note about a month after the hearing, handwritten and delivered to the shop instead of through a lawyer, which surprised Marisol more than anything else Isabelle had ever done. It wasn't quite an apology. It read, in careful, controlled handwriting, "I said what I said because it's what was said to me once, by someone whose approval I never stopped chasing. That's not an excuse. I don't expect one to fix anything." Marisol read it twice, folded it, and didn't respond. Because some doors were allowed to stay closed, and she'd earned the right to decide which ones, she kept the note anyway, tucked into the back of a recipe box. Not as forgiveness, but as a reminder of how far a person could go trying to earn a place that was never going to make them. Happy once they got there, Eli asked her about it once. Months later, having spotted the note by accident while restocking the recipe box. "You ever think about writing her back?" "Every once in a while." Marisol considered the question honestly instead of brushing it off. "But some people only understand kindness as an opening, not a gift. I decided a long time ago I'm not obligated to keep proving I'm bigger than what someone did to me. Sometimes the healthiest ending is just quiet." Eli nodded slowly, filing that away, the way he filed away most things she said without realizing he was building an entire philosophy for himself out of overheard conversations at a bakery counter, and went back to restocking flour without another word. Frank Cho, her landlord, called the shop personally the week after the story broke, voice thick with something between guilt and relief, and told her he was cutting her rent for the next 6 months, whether she agreed to it or not. "I should have told you the second Larkspur made contact," he admitted. "Instead, I let myself get quietly scared into almost losing you as a tenant." Marisol told him there was nothing to forgive, and meant it, because she understood better than most people how easily fear could be mistaken for good. Business sense. Canovas reopened 3 months after that, quietly, no press release, no ribbon cutting, just a hand-painted sign in the window that read, "Under new management, sort of," and a menu built jointly from 2 recipe boxes, one inherited, one earned. Marisol ran the day-to-day. Damon showed up most mornings before the shop technically opened, badly kneading dough in an apron that had once belonged to his mother, learning slowly and on purpose how to do something that had nothing to do with leverage or control. Eli graduated culinary school the following spring and asked to run the new location's morning shift, insisting he'd earned the trust the hard way by learning under Marisol's supervision. That, being handed responsibility and being handed a lecture, were 2 very different kinds of kindness. Mrs. Alvarez still came in every week for her usual, no longer starstruck by the man behind the counter, mostly because he'd finally, after 8 months, learned to make her order correctly without being told twice. Mr. Feldman still came by too, healthier now that his medication schedule had stabilized, and had taken to leaving small hand-drawn thank you cards in the tip jar that Marisol kept in a shoebox of her own, tucked beside the one Damon had found at Canovas the night everything changed between them. Of all people, started dropping by Canovas on his lunch breaks, something none of them saw coming, least of all Reyes himself, who now argues with Eli about the correct crumb texture for sourdough, with a seriousness that borders on concerning for a man in his line of work. Even Frank Cho stops by sometimes, just to sit at the counter and watch the morning rush, like he still can't quite believe the block got to stay exactly as it was. Damon still keeps the recipe card in his coat pocket, even now, even though the exact fold has long since transferred permanently into Marisol's hands and doesn't need the paper anymore to survive. He told her once, half joking, that he kept it out of superstition. She suspected, though she never said it out loud, that he kept it because some things earn the right to be carried even after they've stopped being necessary proof. worn soft at the edges, of exactly how far 9 ordinary mornings could carry to people who never meant to fall in love over bread, a recipe, and a shuttered shop nobody thought would ever open its doors again. At the shop's 1-year anniversary of reopening, Marisol found an envelope tucked under the register, no name on it. Just her handwriting looking back at her from a photocopy of the original recipe card. The faded margin note rewritten clean and legible beneath it. For Leo, always double the honey, and, in Damon's careful, unpracticed hand underneath that, and for whoever finally taught me how, he hadn't rescued her, he hadn't made her worthy of anything. He'd simply refused to ask her to become smaller, so that loving her would be easier for him. Someone from Damon's world, an older man, Marisol vaguely recognized from a magazine spread about. Ashcombe's biggest holding companies approached her near the desert table at a fundraiser months later and asked, not unkindly, how exactly she and Damon had met. Marisol considered several versions of the answer before landing on the truest one. He walked in holding his dead mother's handwriting and asked me to bring it back to life. The man laughed, assuming it was a metaphor. And Marisol let him assume that, because some things were true enough to keep for herself. Eli graduated culinary school the following spring and asked Marisol to pin his certificate to the wall behind the counter herself instead of framing it at home. So people know where it started, he told her, a little embarrassed by his own sentimentality. And she hung it beside a small, unremarkable photograph. Nobody who visited the shop ever asked about a man in a borrowed apron, flour up to his elbows, laughing at something just out of frame. On slow afternoons, Marisol still catches Damon standing just inside the door the way he did that very first morning, watching the room instead of standing at the center of it, and she still teases him for it, and he still pretends not to enjoy being teased. Some mornings still start before sunrise. Flower in the air, Isabelle Kane's name never once spoken between them anymore. Some things, it turns out, were never really about the recipe at all. And some things, like a man learning to walk back into a room he once couldn't bear to enter, take longer than 9 mornings, but arrive exactly the same way. One patient, ordinary batch at a time, until nobody remembers exactly when it stopped feeling like counting. Nobody who watched Damon Russo cross a ballroom to defend a bakery owner that night could have known it started with a stained recipe card and 9 mornings neither of them had meant to count. Some love stories start with fireworks. This one started with a braided loaf that never once came out identical to the original, a data trail nobody thought to trace, and a man finally choosing, in daylight, the one thing money had never once been able to buy him. Someone who had never once needed his name to know exactly who he was. If Damon and Marisol's story touched your heart, please like and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss our next story. And let us know where you're watching from in the comments below. Which moment touched you the most? Share it with us in the comments. See you in the next story.